Greetings, Herle Burlyites. We're going to get right to it. It's a two-part pod today, and a very exciting two-part pod it is. First up is Mark Carney. Yep, that Mark Carney. The former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Mark Carney. The Mark Carney who recently spoke at the Liberal Convention. But I have to ask, how much do you really know about this man? Today, we're going to attempt to crack open the Carney. We'll take a deeper dive into his story. Why a young, successful master of the universe guy just quits to become a bureaucrat in the Department of Finance. We'll talk about the thesis of his new book, Values, Building a Better World for All. And we're going to try to demystify the link between climate action and finance policy, what that means for Canada, and maybe we'll talk a little bit of budget. Part 2 of the pod is NSFW, not safe for work. Let's face it, it may not even be safe for you to listen alone on your goddamned AirPods. It's our political panel with Jenni, accept no bullshit, Byrne and Scott, I have no need of fancy grooming products, Reid. We'll talk about the continuing Ford fallout in Ontario. Sick leave, what sick leave? The Vance sexual misconduct story. How compelling is this politically? Does it even matter? Trudeau's got the guns out in his vaccine photo op, but he's been tardy on travel bans. We'll chat about that. Plus, stick around for our Hey Yous this week. Mark Carney, I want to welcome you to the Herle Burly. So happy to have you here. I've known you well I met you 20 years ago. I've known you well for about 10 years, but you've never had enough time on your hands or been unemployed enough to come on this show before. So thank you for doing it.
This is a new low, David. It's a new low. I'm getting used to it.
You never thought.
Yeah.
You never thought. Oh my God. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Good to see you. I've listened to you, but I haven't seen you for a long time. So it's good to see you. You're looking well.
Blurry, if well. Blurry is actually my best look. Yeah, fuzzy. It's an effect I use on the camera.
Yeah, a little bit of pause. Yeah.
What are you doing for fun? You're in Ottawa. What are you doing for fun?
The city that doesn't wake up. I'm in Ottawa. What am I doing for fun? I mean, it's tough at the best of times. It's difficult. There's not a lot. We've got 2 of our kids are here, so we have fun. The sort of family unit meal times are fun. Something to look forward to. To be honest, look, I'm in a book club. I mean, it's grim, man. It is grim. We're doing the second loop through Schitt's Creek and watching a bit of the Oilers and stuff like that. But and that's on the fringes of like many of us, like you. I'm sleeping at the office, sort of thing, and so I spend a lot of time staring into this device for various work stuff. So there's a bit of fun, but I'm ready to be released when we're released.
I'm sure. Hey, listen, we have a lot of Ontario listeners to this podcast. So would you tell them who in reality is the best hockey team in Canada right now?
The Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers. I had an interview. I was being interviewed the other day. It was American. It was Bloomberg, I think. It was American. Yeah, and he said, this is the year the Leafs are going to win the Cup. And he went on, and I was like, well, what are you talking about? The Oil's going to, they're going to follow the Oil. Connor McDavid, best hockey player in the world. And it stunned. Like, we had 5 seconds of dead air. I don't think we'd ever heard of it. Typical of Americans. But look, it's good. It's Toronto's a great team. Winnipeg's a good team. The Habs could surprise if they get that early season form. No, okay, I couldn't. All right, but I'm feeling good. I'm not. Don't worry, I'm not cocky, but I think Edmonton's got some depth. They've got a great coach, and they do, in my opinion, the greatest player in the world, and that matters. So.
That will there will be people in Toronto that will take that badly if that happens, and I look forward to that. I know that Montreal's not going to beat them. So,
well, it won't matter. You'll still be up there. I'll still be locked in this room, so we'll just read about it.
Exactly. Speaking of Edmonton, you grew up in Edmonton, and when I think of Edmonton, even though I've got family that lives there, I always think of the great Peter Klima. Peter Klima was a Czechoslovakian hockey player who defected during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Yep. And he first played for Detroit. And when there were rumors that he was going to be traded to Edmonton, he was asked for comment. And he said, if I had wanted to play in Edmonton, I would never have left Czechoslovakia.
Look at his hockey card. I didn't know those remarks. See, this was before the days of social media and other things. Those remarks were not published in Edmonton. No one was aware of those remarks. At least I wasn't aware of those remarks. Remember, he came. He was, he was pretty good. He was a bit of a disappointment, I think, on the mark. Although there were so many good players at the time, but
right.
Yeah.
How'd you get out of Edmonton?
How did I get out? Well, I went to university. I went to University of the States. Went to play hockey. Well, I went to learn, but also played hockey there. I probably learned more than I played hockey, truth be told. But enjoyed
sports scholarship or academic scholarship?
Neither. They only. I went to Harvard, and they have financial aid. So you get in or you don't, and it helps if you do other things in getting in. But once you're in, then they just calculate based on your financial needs. So I had financial aid, so it wasn't a scholarship per se, but some grant, some loan, and including some from the Alberta government. So the Noble Scholarship. I was a Noble Scholar. How's that?
Mm.
Like you to refer to me as that for the rest of the pod. Noble Scholar.
Noble Scholar.
Yeah,
I'm writing that. I'm writing
from the Alberta Heritage Fund. I owe one of the many things I owe Alberta.
And Peter Lougheed. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So there's something that's inexplicable about you to me, and you need to explain it to me.
Okay.
And that is, you're in New York City. You're a master of the universe. You're making scads of money. You're living the glamorous life. This is the go-go USA of Bill Clinton and Bob Rubin in the 1990s. And you're at Goldman. And you quit to come back to be an official in the Department of Finance. Not a junior official, but not the boss either. Just an official in the Department of Finance. Why did you do that?
Well, I've always been interested in public policy. I came from, background. My father was an academic, principally an academic, but he was deputy minister for a time in the Alberta government during the Lougheed year. Al Boomer Adair was his minister, both in Northern Affairs and Parks and Recreation. Not the sitcom, but the very serious department in Alberta, and I had been interested. I had done undergrad. I worked for a few years in London and Tokyo. Then I went back and did graduate work in economics, and my intention was to go into something like public policy relatively quickly. As things happened, Goldman got a great assignment working with the ANC, the African National Congress, just as Nelson Mandela was coming into government, and we advised them, and so I came and did that anyways. One blah blah blah. It took 10 more years before I executed coming into public policy. And I actually came into initially the Bank of Canada. David, I saw an ad in the paper for a deputy governor, and I thought, wait, it was my last chance, or here's a chance. And if I'm really serious about this, I should try it. And David Dodge took a chance on me, and the rest, one thing led to another after that. And loved every minute of it.
Interesting. Okay, so you have, in latter years, thrown yourself into the climate change file. And you talk a lot about climate change. A big chunk of your book is about climate change. You're involved in a number of initiatives. But I recall from years past talking to you that you weren't always as focused on this issue as you are now. Did you have, well, I don't want to use necessarily Chrystia Freeland's words, but did you have an epiphany of sorts on this? And what was it?
No, look, there's lots of issues, and I worked on this issue as a civil servant particularly when Ralph Goodale was finance minister. There was a climate plan at the time, and Then, obviously when I was governor of the Bank of Canada, we had the financial crisis and the core work there. Really where it came to a head is once I was governor of the Bank of England, one of the many things you're responsible for as the Bank of England is you oversee the insurance industry. And that means it's the fourth largest insurance industry in the world. And it includes Lloyd's of London, which is this incredible, 3 century plus old institution that does things like insure hockey players' knees, which they do, but also they are one of the biggest insurers of property in the Gulf of Mexico, and their biggest risk is basically climate change. So they have to be absolutely on top of it, and the Bank of England has to be on top of it. And what we saw, and they knew, was that the number of extreme weather events had tripled in the last few decades. The cost of that had gone up 5 times, so huge, hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's actually just the insured cost. There's much bigger costs that aren't insured. And it's very obvious that, I knew it was happening, but the scale of it happening and the speed with which it was changing becomes present. And then in parallel, and this is about 6 years ago, I guess, I'm asked, because I'm overseeing at the time all the financial reforms post-crisis, something called the Financial Stability Board, so the global reforms for that. And I was asked by the G20 leaders, what's the role of financial sector in dealing with climate change? And so the response was, well, there's an issue here, which is, and I termed it, there's the tragedy of the horizon, which is that by the time it's a clear and present danger for everybody in the financial sector, not just the Lloyd's of London and the big insurance industry, it's going to be too late to meet the climate goals. It's going to be too late to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. And you need to think about, you leaders with the financial sector is just not going to front run politics and policy. You have to grab this and pull it forward. And that led to a series of reforms and measures, including, I won't bore you with them, but very important plumbing reforms that are now absolutely mainstream. At the time, it was viewed as, there was a wide range of opinion on that. And, but I think, it would have been good if we had done that 10 years previously. I wasn't in a role to do that, and I wouldn't have seen it. It's all of that is now is becoming mainstream, and we're working on the next phase of addressing it.
What do your conversations about climate change go like with your friends from Alberta?
They've moved over time. I think the recognition. I've never had a conversation with people in Alberta about the issue of whether or not it was happening. There's a range of opinions, but or the speed with which it's happening. But what the contribution could be from Alberta, of Canada, to part of the solutions, what the responsibilities of others are, how seriously the world was taking it. I think what's happened in terms of the financial sector and how central this is now viewed in terms of investment and lending of major financial participants all over the world. Look, we just signed up $70 trillion. $70 trillion. I'm going to repeat that. American dollars, for net zero plans from across the financial sector, and that number is going to grow between now and Glasgow. So I think we were a bit slow to recognize that was coming, and it's been clear for a while it was coming. It's probably come a little sooner than I would have expected, but I did expect that we would end up where we are today.
So does that mean that that $70 trillion has signed on to a set of targets and protocols that mean they really can't invest in the oil sands anymore?
Well, this is not that per se. So what they've signed on, this is very important, is they've signed up for, I'm going to go from easy to hard, okay? So the easy bit is that a country or a energy company or a bank says, I'll be net zero by 2050, right? That's quite far. It's not easy to get there, by the way, but it's easy sort of to say, make that commitment. And of course, the more reputable you are, if you make the commitment you intend to make it. Then you pull it back and say, okay, well, where are you going to be in 2030? 2030, it sounds like a long time, but it's not a long time when you think about an energy company or an auto company. For an auto company, that's 1 or 2 models, right? And I'll think of all the R&D and development and plant design you have to do, particularly if you're switching from internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. So we see it. So, and you think about changing the portfolio, the generation mix of a utility, or substantially reducing the carbon footprint of the oil sands, or getting up and running in scale, real scale, not just sort of pilot projects, carbon capture and storage, which is what we need for the oil sands, which is what we need for the hydrogen economy, natural gas. 9 years from now it's not tomorrow, but it's, the day after tomorrow, in terms of what needs to be done. So, and the key for these, and so looping back to what you were asking for these financial institutions, is $70 trillion. One of the key things we've been trying to do is say, okay, so you have to say where you're going to be in 2030. Okay, so what proportion of the 50% reduction that the world needs to do to be on track in order to get to net zero by 2050? I can explain the math if you want, but that's basically what's required. And then what are you doing in the next 5 years? What's your decarbonization for the next 5 years, your plan? And how are you going to do it by various industries? The key thing, though, which we're trying to get in, and I think we are succeeding, is it's decarbonization. So if there's a company, and I won't name specific ones, but a company out in the oil patch, the energy patch in Alberta, who is going to make a big investment, or a consortium of big investments that are going to pull carbon out of the process and decarbonize, then we want banks, investors to put money behind that. And when they put money behind it, the actual portfolio, I'm realizing most people will be listening to this, not watching it, so my very clear hand movements are only for your benefit. But initially, the carbon in that portfolio of the bank or the investor will go up. And so we're designing a system so that, but there's credit for the fact that that investment initially will lead to lower carbon 5 years out or 10 years out. And that's absolutely critical. And that's, so, Carville was, it's the economy stupid, it's the transition stupid. It's not just jumping to overnight to a green future. Be nice if we could do, but we can't just do that. And so you need to get the money behind. So look, it means, but what it does mean for any company anywhere in the world increasingly is, if you are a major emitter, what's your plan? What's your plan to get your emissions down? What kind of investments do you intend to make? What's your pathway to get there? And if you're part of the solution, you're going to get capital thrown at you. If you're part of the problem, if you're slow, it's becoming very expensive and difficult to raise money. So, but the former is definitely the case. That's the other side of that 70 trillion. This money needs to be put to work.
I spent the first decade of my life as a farm boy in rural Saskatchewan. So here's an innovation I never thought I'd see. The most important piece of equipment in farming today isn't a tractor, a combine, or a plow. It's the smartphone a farmer holds in their hand. Yep, new technologies like AI, robotics, big data, and network connectivity have changed how we farm, for the better. And our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is a big part of that change with TELUS Agriculture and the power of 5G. It helps farmers optimize every aspect of how our food gets from seed to farm to fork. Cloud-based farm management platforms, working with a farmer's own experience and intuition, are all right there on their phone. Farmers can more easily plan and track all their field activities and collaborate with others. The ability to apply water, pesticides, and nutrients in exact quantities only when and where they're needed. Fewer inputs, fewer wasted resources, and lower GHG emissions mean less environmental impact. Costs are better managed, yields increase. Record keeping for the storage, movement, and sale of product becomes more accurate. And food traceability for an entire industry is massively improved, farm to fork. All those efficiencies lead to growth, but it's not just the crops. It's growth for an entire industry, one with a massive impact on the Canadian economy, directly traceable to TELUS Agriculture and the growth of 5G technology. You can learn more about it at telus.com/5G. You're doing a lot of work with the UN.
Into submission there.
No,
yes.
You have not. You're doing a lot of work with the UN. What's that like? I have a pretty jaundiced view, but I only really follow the Security Council. What's it like to work with the UN?
You follow the Security Council. Well done. That's good.
Yeah.
What's it like working with the UN? Well, look, what I do is, and I spend half my time on this at least, is I am a special envoy, a Nobel Scholar and special envoy, if you could use both of those from now on, for the Secretary General on climate finance. So what we're talking about, so the private sector finance for climate. And how to organize the financial system and get them behind being part of the solution for climate change, getting money to that example we just talked about, the company in Alberta that's going to reduce its carbon footprint, okay? Or a new renewable or a new technology, all that, but organizing the whole system. And I'm also Prime Minister Boris Johnson's advisor on exactly the same issue. And all of this is coming together for this COP meeting, COP26 in Glasgow, which is the big climate meeting this November in Glasgow, which is why you had the Biden summit, why you had Canada's new target, why we'll just be here, the rolling on that. So look, I spend, we've got a team of about 30 people based in London, third private sector, third from Bank of England, third from sort of the Treasury, UK Treasury. And what we do is we're organizing and organized a whole work plan to get the plumbing in place in the financial sector to deal with this issue, and to get private institutions, which I think the 70 trillion number gives you a sense of the scale, lined up to be part of this solution. There's probably I've lost count, but there's probably about 1,000 people in the private sector who are working on various working groups on setting up new carbon markets, dealing with people like the World Bank, so they're more effective, and on and on and on. So I don't get, to be honest, I'm not involved in the UN, the joys of the UN bureaucracy, or the good. Right. Obviously I deal with Secretary General and Amina Mohammed, who is the Deputy Secretary General, who's outstanding. And literally when you're talking to these people, they are coming out of a discussion or about to go into the discussion of some horrible, global issue or, challenge from the pandemic through to, some of the most difficult hotspots in the world. So they have my admiration, but it would be a tough place to work, that's for sure.
Yeah. So you got a book out.
I've got a book.
Here it is.
Yes.
You've got a book out. Here it is.
Can I see the
Values.
spine? Can I see if it's been cracked? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll be able to say. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I read a different version of it. Some people say they struggled with finishing it, but they just don't like big words, those people. I found the book exciting because it contains the seeds of a different governing philosophy and an intellectual break with Reagan and Thatcher, in my view. What's the thesis? If you could just take our listeners and viewers through it, what is the basic thesis of the book?
Yeah, well, let me, I'll maybe say a word on the genesis and then I'll get to the thesis, which is that, as you mentioned, I said, I was a central bank governor, G7 governor. I started just on the eve of the global financial crisis and I literally handed over the keys to the Bank of England the middle of March last year. So just as the UK was locking down, and we're launching the first phases of the response to the COVID crisis. And in between, we had the Euro crisis, we had Brexit, we had the mounting climate crisis. So I was basically a governor through a series of crises. And what I wanted to do is step back and think, okay, well, is there a common driver of this, and what is there? And I did feel really that both in looking back over the sweep of economic thought and also the experience of these crises, that we had lost a balance between some of the core values that are necessary first for the market to function well. So, I mean, I'm a big believer in markets, and I'm a big believer in markets can serve a role in solving our biggest problems. But markets don't exist in a vacuum. Markets are social conventions in the end. Sorry, the big words there, but social conventions. And they have, you need fairness. You need a sense of fairness, responsibility. You need a resilience to markets. You can't have markets just crumble as they did with the subprime crisis. And so you need those elements. You need markets, or markets also, though, are largely short-term, or can be short-term. We are, as individuals, are short-term. So we have this tragedy of the horizon with respect to climate. So how do we bring in elements of sustainability? How do we bring in elements of solidarity? In other words, regional solidarity in Canada, solidarity with others in societies, leaning against the forces of inequality. And how do we marry all of those with the power of markets, what I call dynamism of markets, which is what's going to lead to innovation and growth and better jobs, et cetera. And so how do we bring back that balance? And so the thesis is that pendulum, and it's on more dimensions than two, has become unbalanced, and it walks through a number of examples. And it really starts from a place where actually how economics views value, up until the 19th century, it was viewed as either something intrinsic to the good or the activity, or a reflection of the labor and the work that had been put into the activity. That's what Adam Smith thought. That's what David Ricardo thought. It happened also to be what Marx thought. And it gets flipped around in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, and intensified over the course of the last several decades, where the value of something is its price, and only its price. And if something isn't priced, it does not have value. That's the way things become treated. So, I mean, I use this example on climate, which is we know precisely the value of Amazon, the company, $1.7 trillion. The Amazon, the region, has no value until actually you start burning the forest and convert it into farmland. Well, that doesn't really make sense. We have a tendency, and this is a little less in Canada, but we see it in the UK and the US and other places, where of paying for charity, of bringing charitable or volunteer acts, blood donation, other charitable acts into the market. And what happens is that changes people's behavior. It corrodes the underlying value. Okay, so that's the set of issues. I'm not explaining it in purely linear form. You got to read the book, but it goes through that.
Yeah.
And then what I try to do, and part of the reason why it's longer, the book, is to say, okay, so what? Because it's quite frustrating when you get these sort of quite elaborate analyses of the problem without any suggestion of solution. And so what the book does is look at these three crises: climate, COVID, and credit being the financial crisis, and say, okay, what are some of the responses to that? And then what are the lessons? What does that mean if you're a leader of an organization, if you're a company or a country? What are the types of things you should do to reinforce these broader set of values: fairness, responsibility, solidarity, sustainability, alongside dynamism? And I'm I do make the point, and this is a sincere point, and you would expect that I would have figured this out after 30 years. It finally came to me, humility being the seventh value and the most important value. And it is important. Humility is a very important value. But not humility that's incapacitating. You've got to marry ambition and humility in a way that's effective. And I try and draw that out. So
I'll pass that along to Scott Reid. So when I'm reading you in this book and you're describing this, my mind is turning to my nostalgic view of the 1960s, when the difference between what CEOs made and their workers made was much smaller than it is now, where rich people got taxed at high rates, where people got good union jobs that they had for life with benefits, and business leaders lived in the communities in which their businesses operated and cared about the communities in which their businesses operated. That may all be rose-colored nostalgia, but that's what I'm thinking about. But I don't hear anybody calling for us to return to the 1960s.
I think, first thing, there's always a danger of picking a point in time. There's this, sort of sadade, right? You had this view of a time, a nostalgia for a time that never was, or your interpretation of a time that never was. But there are elements, and I'm not saying that this is not a call for the back to the 60s in any way, shape, or form. In fact, one of the core points of the book, and I think one of the key challenges we have as a country, others share it, is how do we take the technologies and the opportunities, the risks and opportunities that come with them, and build a more balanced system. I mean, the book is about building a better world for all, and a lot of that can be done through greater connectivity in a way that builds, the regional economy in Canada, that helps our small businesses, take on the world through platforms and others. But let me loop back to your core question. I think one of the issues, and I spend a fair bit of time in the book on it, is around corporate purpose and the nature of a company. So I am not a Friedmanite. I think that should be clear. I think Friedman, in part, he did some, brilliant guy, and did some made some good points in a variety of ways, but his fundamental shareholder primacy it's fundamentally wrong, and it's fundamentally, in my view, flawed, because he gives himself an out in that the only purpose of business is making profit for shareholders, and he says subject to the ethical customs of the time, the ethics and the customs of the age. So subject to, and he assumes that those are unchanged by an emphasis solely on profit. And in fact, he says that any activity, he literally says in a famous essay, any activity that is support for the community or support for the workers is hypocritical window dressing, which, if it serves the purpose of quote unquote hypocritical window dressing, if it serves the purposes of enticing people in or pulling the wool over people's eyes, then that's okay. But it really is ultimately just for that goal. And that's wrong. That's wrong for two reasons. One, there is a corrosion of at its purest market fundamentalism. And the book goes through, it doesn't matter if it's in the book. You see that in the financial markets. You see that I lived it in the run-up and had to deal with it as a public official in the run-up to the crisis and afterwards. You see it in the social strains that we have because of these greater extremes that have built up between whether it's CEO compensation or those on the shop floor, how we pay our essential workers, not for what we need them for in essential times, but only for normal times, right? Still there. And you also see it, I think there's a real economic issue, which is you don't see it. If you have a sense of purpose and a sense of alignment that you can get from a company, in other words, you're solving an issue. Shopify has a sense of purpose. Its purpose is mass entrepreneurialism. Its purpose is to make it easier to start a business and sell anywhere. And that animating purpose actually helps those who supply Shopify, those who go on it. It organizes the community. I mean, it has that knock-on effect, which actually is self-fulfilling. It's good for Shopify itself, but it's good for the shareholders, the employees, and very importantly, the customers, the clients, the businesses that are there. So that world where you have a company with a sense of purpose, which you have that solidarity within a company, with its community, and with its within the company. I think there is a rebalancing towards that, and if I can bring it up a level to a country and country objectives. So we're going through two huge rewirings of our economy, right? We're at the cusp. We're still early innings of the digital rewiring of the economy. It's been accelerated by COVID, but there's a lot more to come. And I say in the book, what are we going to be digital by default? Are we just going to let this happen on the way that the technology companies determine is best? Or are we going to be digital by design? Are we going to design policies? Are we going to help people build the skills? Are we going to organize things so that as many Canadians can benefit as possible from it? And you can see ways that can happen. I go through the book. On climate and sustainability, we are getting to a point, and this is a key point and an opportunity for us. Some see it as a challenge. I think it's an opportunity where we have moved to, we're going to deal with climate. We've got 130 countries now joined by the United States that say we're going to get to net zero. We've got 1,500 of the world's largest companies who say net zero. We've got 70 trillion of money as of last week saying we're going to go to net zero. So there's an animating purpose, an objective that changes the equation, because that means that lots of smart people, lots of driven people, lots of inquisitive people around the world are going to be figuring out how we best get to net zero, and they will get there in a way that is, more effective, cheaper, quicker than a government would. And that's, to go back to the title of the book, which is Values with a parentheses around the S. That's how you get value in the market serving the values of society.
I'm a little unclear as to how you break the stranglehold of shareholders on corporate behavior, because I'm not an ethical investor. I direct my investments to wherever I can get the greatest return. We're repeatedly told when we rail against corporate malfeasance that our pension funds are all invested in those. And if we wanted our pension funds to invest ethically, we'd have to settle for less in our retirement. I know I work with a lot of CEOs that would like to be doing their jobs differently, but they got to report to these shareholders on a quarterly basis. And if the shareholders don't think they're doing everything they can to drive up the share price, they get, the CEO will be replaced. So, it may be that corporations shouldn't only run for the benefit of shareholders, but shareholders have a chokehold on them, don't they?
Well, I think first thing is there's a variety of premises in that question that are wrong. It might not be. And I will grant you that you don't invest ethically. I'd like to let the record show that. But the first is that there is this trade-off. Look, the evidence is very strong. Look, I'm someone who's been in and around financial markets for 3 decades, right? On the private side or the public side. So I know something about this. And the book goes through this in some detail. The alignment, the correlation between broader ESG, and there's, I won't give you all the details, like the number of them are in the book, including the footnotes, but is about 60% of the analyses find a positive correlation between companies that score more highly on weighing ethical, social, and governance factors and their performance. Okay, 90% across 2,200 different studies and others show an alignment that is at least neutral. So it's neutral to positive, overwhelming evidence. Why is that the case? First thing is there are a series of issues. You're avoiding, in many cases, what you're doing is you're screening out a problem. You're screening out a Volkswagen or a company that is going to do something bad and eventually going to be caught out on it. Sorry, Volkswagen, but the old Volkswagen.
Yeah, it's a good example.
Well, it is a good example. It is a good example, and one that could have been predicted. So first is you're screening out that. Secondly, you also, and again, it depends on society's broader values, but there are knock-on effects in terms of the type of people you attract to companies, how well you work with your suppliers, how much innovation you do. And again, lots of the evidence is in the book on this and elsewhere. And if people are really interested, don't just read the book, read the footnotes and go into the sole source. So you get this alignment and you get better performance as a consequence of it. And one of the issues, and so this is an issue around climate, and it also depends on what your view is of where we're going as a society. So I think you could have seen where maybe not as rapidly and as comprehensively as now is the case, but that countries and people were going to take climate more and more seriously. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, one could have seen it. Certainly 5 years ago, could have seen it.
Yep.
And well, if that's the case, well, what are the companies that are starting to take it more seriously themselves? How do I, that's, and they may not be getting the short-term return, but boy, they're in a better position now. And the market is weighing them in a better position now. And that's very clear. So I think that there are cases, just let me finish on this. And one of the things we're doing, sorry to bring it back, I'm sorry to go into detail, but part of the reason I go into detail is to make clear that these aren't bromides, platitudes, statements. There's real things behind it. So one of the things that we're doing for Glasgow and for the system is that the accounting, what companies disclose, used to just be financial information, basically. And now they're moving towards disclosing, well, what are their risks around climate, opportunities around climate? And there's a need to make that as comprehensive and consistent as possible. And so there's a body which governs ultimately the disclosure of the accounting rules in Canada called the IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards. It covers 140 countries. Up until now, has all been financial, is about to include sustainability and starting with climate. Now, it will only include those factors for climate that have or prospectively have a financial impact on the company. Okay. So now your judgment, or the person who invests or lends out your money, their judgment is going to be, well, which of those aligns and what's the horizon over which it aligns? But these factors are material and they hadn't been disclosed in a formal, consistent way until now. And those people who were investing in a purely Friedman-esque way were missing this, and they have missed it. And that's why those types of funds, only about half of them survive over 10 years, whereas about 70% of the other funds, ESG funds, have survived over the last 10 years. So, sorry, I'm throwing a lot of different stuff at you, but now, if society, last point I guess I should make, which is if society decides, if Canadians decide, all we care about is profit. That's all we care about. That we don't care about the environment. We don't care about diversity in our companies. We don't care about our communities. We don't care about any of this other stuff. And that's reflected in our consumer choices. It's reflected in our politicians and our laws and our regulations. Then that world dominates. But if Canadians care about those other things, and you don't need me to tell you they do, then it ultimately does get reflected in what we buy, in the types of governments that come in, the types of rules that come into place, and that affects the viability of companies as well.
You're heartened in the book, and use it a bit foundationally, how Canada and other countries, but let's just leave it at Canada for now, how Canada reacted to COVID. And that our values dominated our economic interests. We prioritized health over business and the economy. And that really felt true a year ago. I don't know how true that feels to me today. Is that really how Ford is governing? Is that really how business has responded, withdrawing the danger pay the second it was possible to do it from frontline workers? Is that how the owners of long-term care homes have behaved? No. And now we seemingly don't care about long-term care homes anymore. We're on to new challenges. So I'm a little less buoyant about how we've reacted to COVID, but maybe you have a different take.
I have, on the whole, I would stand by that conclusion, and I'd stand by that conclusion in terms of the behavior of Canadians. So as individuals, look, and everybody listening, you, me. It is difficult living life, even though we're relatively privileged in our ability to do what we do, or absolutely privileged, maybe I should say. It is difficult living, life in a lockdown, time after time. There's a strain. There's a strain on your, your personal relationships, a strain on your family. There can be economic strains, big economic strains, lost opportunities, and all that. But by and large, and vast majority of Canadians are respecting this. This is why I thought actually the absolute nonsense of the police orders of 2 weeks ago. I mean, it was an insult because Canadians, Ontarians, they're abiding by there were exceptions, always except 14 million people in the province. Of course, there's exceptions, but they're abiding by things, and they're abiding by things. Yes, because they care about their family, but also because they care about other Ontarians whom they will never meet. Right. That is, and the book draws it out with the example of what's called a value of statistical life, which is used to make economic calculations about various policies. That behavior shows a much higher value of other people's lives than traditional economic analysis would suggest. It shows a fundamental value in solidarity and others. And so I do think it's there. And I also think that, and this is one of the more difficult things, but it's a lesson we can't lose, is the experience underscores, the still large inequities in our society, and which have been deepened by the experience. We see where the incidence falls of the health and the economic impacts, and so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about those two things, and how do you build from that last point, which is that one of the experiences and one of the reasons why you don't price volunteer, aside from it's an oxymoron to price volunteering, but one of the reasons you don't is
not to get into the wee scandal.
Can't imagine what you're talking about. Anyways, is that it's contagious. The people who volunteer more. They have a sense of social responsibility, and they also, their example encourages others to do it. And so in my judgment, we're living through now a very long period where just by the way people live every day is an act of kindness or volunteering, but also there's lots of acts of kindness for neighbors and support workers and PP and others that have come through in this, and that's something to really build on. And now, sorry to loop this back, but if I can loop this back to one of the themes in the book, because one of the core things, one of the departures for the book, starting points for the book is what Adam Smith really said, all of what Adam Smith said. And very importantly, there's the genius of division of labor and the power of the market. But core to what Smith says is the other book, the unread book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is is the social construct that's around, and how our moral sentiments, how we behave to each other. We reflect back what others esteem, what others value. I don't want to say there's a market in moral sentiment, but behavior begets behavior, and good behavior begets good behavior. So in other words, if you only care about shareholder value, that begets, I only care about money, money, money. If you beget, volunteerism and caring about each other, that provides, and that's the necessary balance. I mean, I make it sound like it is an equation. It's a necessary balance to the market, but it's what enriches experience, and it means that the market is then serving what we really, much of what we can value.
So how do we inject more of our value systems into the market? Is government our only vehicle to represent the values of our society to the market, or do Canadians have other ways of influencing?
Yeah, I think there's roles for government in various areas, and I go through some of them. But I think it starts with all of us. In different ways. We're all leaders in some aspect within an organization. You could be leading on a project. You could be CEO of a company, and the question is what values you exhibit in that, and how you bring others along, and how you develop others, and whether or not you have humility as a leader, one of the most important characteristics of leadership, in my view. If you're a company, if you work for a company, what's the purpose of the company? What solution is it trying to provide? And is the way it operates consistent with that? Does it care about its community? Does it give back in any way, shape, or form? And so I think there's, and I do go through the book in this, and that there are various ways to instill this. And I do think that, from my experience on financial reform, so, take finance, which is the market in many ways, the market unbridled. And we did a number of things in financial reform to change the perspective, or align the perspectives of senior people in finance with what society needs, which is a market that doesn't blow up. And, there's not too much to ask, right? Like, don't blow up the market and tumble us all into a multi-year recession that it took the UK 10 years to dig out of. And so how do you do that? You hold back a bunch of compensation for a number of years, and they gradually get those bonuses if they haven't done anything wrong, right? That's one thing.
Yeah.
Again, not too much to ask. Or if you find out that they hadn't taken unnecessary, risks, or hadn't trained people in the way. So that's one way you do it. Another way you do it is you make the senior managers more responsible for those who work for them. So if I oversee, 100 people, obviously I don't control those people, but did I train those people? Do those people know what they're supposed to do? Do they have the tool? And then that type of responsibility. But even with all of that, and those are quite big reforms put in place, and that's part of what I did when I was in the UK. In the end, you can't legislate virtue. You wouldn't try to legislate virtue, right? The question is, do I, if I'm running a bank or running some big operation in a bank, do I see myself as a custodian of that institution as well as doing my job? Do I see myself at least as part of the system? Do I see myself as having some responsibility for my clients? Or am I, is everything, am I totally compartmentalized? So right. You do need those elements, and government can't provide those. You don't want government trying to provide those elements. And so there's a societal element to it. And it's, again, good behavior gets reflected and imitated. And, that's not to give away the ending, but that's, the last chapter of the book tries to make this point. And it's the short chapter, so people can read that.
One of the things I've been really focused on throughout this whole pandemic, and even before, is because, frankly, actually, Kathleen Wynne ran her last campaign about this, the care economy, the people that are in the business of care. And in your book, you talk a lot about how the jobs of the future, a lot of it's going to be in care. And that's not a sector that we value very much right now. We don't pay people very much to be in it. We don't make those good jobs. We don't make it something people ought to see as a career and stay in for their whole lives. We don't expect much training for these jobs. It seems to me that in almost every way, we have valued the people who work either for pay or not for pay in the care world. We've undervalued them.
Yeah, I think that's, unfortunately, I think that's true. And I don't have an immediate answer to, I think, the challenge you put to me half an hour or so ago about what's our staying power in improving long-term care, whether it's in Ontario or across the country, and the balance of responsibilities of us as individuals, the state, those who work in long-term care, the resources that are put into that. We've got a ways. Yeah, we've got a ways to go on that, without question. And not because. Look, the numbers just dictate. The demographics dictate that this will be a growing area for work. And a sense of responsibility drives and fairness drives the need to do much better. I mean, it's a very low bar to say we should do better. Just to be clear, I'm not seeing this as the engine of the economy. I think our engines, looking to the future, they really will come in and around the new digital economy, bioengineering, and around sustainability, and we have to be much more clear-eyed about that and deliberate about seizing those opportunities, so that we can, or preparing and seizing those opportunities, so we can move forward.
Cool. Can I ask you a couple of questions about the federal budget last week?
Sure.
All right. You look ready. You look steeled.
I've read it all yet. So many hours in a day.
There's two aspects I want to ask you about. The first one is growth. So even before COVID, Canada was an economy in transition. The decline of oil and gas as an export, the shriveling of our manufacturing base, the coming wave of digitization all mean we needed a plan for a strong growing economy. The budget set aside $100 billion for growth investment, in addition to whatever was being done on COVID. Is that the growth budget we needed? Do you see the growth plan in there?
So there's, I think the first thing to say is about the budget is that the budget was trying to do multiple things, look to do multiple things, as you know, and part of it was supporting, getting us, conquering COVID, I think is how the minister phrased it, which is a good frame. And so substantial resources for that. And then some quite significant social spending. I think the OAS example, the increase in the OAS is more than, I think it's $12 billion there. Important initiative, well discussed. You discussed it at length, I think, last week on your pod on childcare. So I'll just refer to those discussions, which is obviously an economic as well as social and I think an example of solidarity. But to go in terms of, and there were elements of growth in the balance from what I can see and understand, elements around supporting more sustainable economy and the investment that will drive that. And that is, I think, will lead to growth and jobs. I wouldn't, having worked on 7 budgets when I was at the Department of Finance. We used to have a lot of, when there were minority governments before, we used to have a lot of budgets. That's what I remember. We had more budgets, which is how I managed to work on 7 in 4 years. No, I think there is room for the type of, it will take a few budgets to have the type of growth strategy that meets the imperatives of what we're going through, and the opportunities that come with that. And to be clear, there are big opportunities here, but they won't just happen. They won't, we have to prepare for them and seize them. And I think look, there's a natural desire after an experience like what we've lived through to I'd like to I think we all would like to just go back to the way things were, right? We want to get, and a lot of that is like, we'd like to go to the pub and listen to some music and go in the backyard barbecue with a bunch of people, not worry about things, and on, and go to a hockey game instead of just watch it. That's right. There are certain times where there are big shifts, and where events accelerate big shifts. This COVID has absolutely accelerated both the digital and sustainable revolutions. And it is not an overstatement to say those are revolutions. And we need to meet the challenges at that level. And I think budget did some things in that direction, which are welcome, but it's going to take more than one budget. And I don't think the government would pretend otherwise, that this is job done.
Cool. All right, my second one's even tougher. I have to ask you about the deficit, okay? I don't want to be worried about this because I love the new theory that they don't matter. But I think that my approach to they don't matter sort of violates...
By the way, that's not a theory. Sorry, I just have to interject. That's not a theory. That's a statement. That they don't. Deficits.
Well, I'm just assuming that they don't matter because you can run $350 billion deficits, and you can plan to run deficits in the range of $30 to $40 billion ad infinitum, and you know that those are going to be higher than they are. So the rules have changed, but it seems to violate two rules you outlined in your book. One of which is the four most expensive words in the English language. This time is different.
Yeah.
And secondly, if it can't be explained to you, it might not be true.
If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense.
If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. So, like I had Jim Stanford on the show last week, and Jim Stanford says to me that actually the cost of money to government right now is net negative. And so you're stupid not to take it. Which then gives me that, well, why did they stop? Why don't we have pharmacare and long-term care reform? Why didn't they cut taxes? What matters now in this world about money?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One is just because something is possible doesn't mean it's optimal, right? So just because you can spend money doesn't mean you spend all the money that you can spend, right? I mean, there's a question of what are you getting for that money? And let me take a further step back, which is I think there's a basic question that we always have to start with, and it's very easy to slip into it's X billion for this and X billion for that, as opposed to saying, what are we getting? How many people will benefit from this policy? What do we think this is going to do for their earning power over time? If it's about sustainability, how much carbon are we going to take out of the atmosphere? How many exports are we going to help to build with this? If it's for pharmacare or other things, the livelihood impact, the health impact of all that. What are we trying to accomplish as an outcome, as opposed to the input, which is the amount of money that's spent? Much more time on the end state, the impact, and then trying to figure the way to accomplish the impact in as an efficient way as possible. And I'll give you another example and I'll come back to where you're headed, which is there is a lot that can be accomplished, and there's a lot being accomplished right now in Europe. Europe has said no new internal combustion engines cars can be sold in Europe after 2030. UK has said the same thing. So what does that do? So that, okay, they had to think it through. It cost a bit to type that into the the EU Recovery Fund and the rules and get it all passed, and they had to stay up and agree to it, but it didn't cost much money. What it does, though, is it means massive, and it's already started, private investment in charging infrastructure, the vehicles for that, and innovation that comes with it. And that is what is happening in Europe. It actually has a spillover effect because it tells people in North America in the industry, we might not be 2030, but are we 2035 or are we 2037? You can see what's coming. Okay. So It's not all about fiscal. It's not all about spending. It's as much about framing and using smart regulation and signposts that, again, what are the values of society with the regulation? Value driven by the private investment in the market. So the first big issue with spend is, what are you actually getting for the spend? And when you have a surge of spending, is that next big initiative well thought through? Is it going to be effective? And in a federation, I know from past experience, when federal, provincial, shared spending, it's a lot of work to make sure that that's as effective delivering for Canadians, because in the end, it's about delivering for Canadians. The second thing is that if we're successful, the collective we are successful in what we're doing, and Jim Stanford is right. Right now, the inflation-adjusted cost of borrowing is negative, right? So you can, so it's possible. It's absolutely right. And it is also right, the direction of the scale of some of the spending, given the absolute COVID crisis and the need to come out. But if we're successful in growing this economy, and we all want to be successful in growing this economy, interest rates are going to rise. They're going to rise. If we're not successful, they're not going to rise. But if we're successful, they're going to rise. And Canadian interest rates are also going to rise as a product of where American interest rates go. I mean, we're very tightly correlated with those as well. And they're going to rise both on the real side, so the headline number minus inflation, but potentially also on the inflation side. And the other issue that we have to be mindful of is that, and this is basic macroeconomics, but if you have big fiscal, all things being equal, you unless you're in a fiscal crisis, it's supportive. It pushes your currency up. So that's fine if you're. It's nice to have a stronger dollar. We can't go anywhere with it, most of us, but it's got to be sustainable.
The one benefit, yeah.
But it's got to be sustainably so. And so if your fiscal is helping to drive a better economy, better jobs, more productivity, higher wages, that's all great. But if it's for current spending, transfers to individuals, transfers to provinces that just go through the system, it's not necessarily accomplishing that. And you're locking in a level of spending and a level of deficit that ultimately will have to be paid for, serviced at higher interest rates down the road. So these are all the difficult judgments that governments have to make around the world at present. I think what we're seeing, last point, is that what we're seeing, in my judgment, this was a hybrid budget in that it had to conquer COVID. It was, doing some important things on the social side, and it had the start of the growth. What we're seeing in some other jurisdictions is that the focus is more squarely on the growth. And when the focus is more squarely on the growth, then more and more of the spending is the type, either direct government investment or the type of tax and other measures that are really encouraging private investment and the growth in jobs and incomes that we need down the road.
Cool. Mark, I've really imposed on your time and I'm running out of it. I just want to ask you in a very general way, I've been asking people for years in surveys, do you think that the next generation is going to have a better quality of life, a worse quality of life, or similar quality of life to the one that this generation has enjoyed? And people have turned negative on that over the last decade or so, probably since 2007. People have turned negative on that. You've 3 children about to leave the nest and enter the world. How do you feel about that question?
I've just, for the record, in case any of them listen, I have 4 children.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Sorry, yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah.
4. How do I feel about that? I'm not as pessimistic. I think that, provided we recognize the scale of what's happening, these big changes can, they properly handled, they lead to better outcomes. We can have a more sustainable economy. We can have an economy where, you never would have left Saskatchewan. I wouldn't have left the Mid-Northwest Territories, Alberta, and be plugged into the full range of opportunities that we've experienced. Those won't just happen by accident. And I think we do have to recognize as well that, and I think it came up at the tail end of your conversation last week. Boy, I mean, this generation right now is we on unchanged policies and direction. We're bequeathing them a climate crisis, right? First and foremost, that they care about, and they're making clear they care about. They've just taken a huge hit to their education because the education experience has been at best average, but in many cases terrible for the last year, whether the kids are in university or school. I mean, this is a tragedy, and the payback of that will happen over time. And we're talking, in some cases, very loosely about bequeathing them a massive amount of debt. And if we're bequeathing them a massive amount of debt, we better have got something for it. Now, recognizing all those issues, we can absolutely, and our objective should be that we're delivering a better world for them, building a better world for all. Values available.
There we go. Well, available at the Indigo closest to you. Mark, that Paul Martin says that you can affect more change in 5 minutes in government than you can in 5 years in business. I just thought I would just leave that.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
just roll that around in the back of your head.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on, man. This was amazing and fascinating. And, I left half of it on the table, so I'd love for you to come back sometime. But this was terrific, and I really appreciate it. Real pleasure and honor to talk to you today.
It was my pleasure. And I hope to see you before the end of the summer up by the lake. It would be fantastic. We deserve it, I think.
Yeah, the bugs are out. The bugs are out now.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Okay. Thank you. You too. So, last week we talked about a pretty big business story. Our sponsor, CN, has offered $30 billion for Kansas City Southern, a fellow Class 1 railroad operating out of the American Midwest. You can just imagine the buzz in the railroad community. Merging with KCS would extend CN's network, which now spans Canada and the United States, all the way down to Mexico City and to major ports on Mexico's east and west coasts. Think about that. The first railway with tracks across all 3 countries. It would fulfill the vision of continental free trade begun with the signing of NAFTA 27 years ago. It would create the premier railway of the 21st century. I said last week it's the perfect railroad marriage, and it is. Both railroads have been rolling for more than 100 years of shared history. Trains like CN's Supercontinental and KCS's Flying Crow and Southern Belle are legends in the railroad pantheon. Now, CN is not the only railway interested in KCS. There is another bid on the table, but CN's is the superior offer in every respect. Already, hundreds of customers, suppliers, and elected officials have spoken up to endorse the merger. They know it will mean more and better options for shippers and more competitive rates. Talks with CN are now getting underway, and everybody's pretty excited. This merger fits into the whole building back green thing. Trains take thousands of trucks away from the highways. Yes, they use fossil fuels, but they're so efficient. And railways like CN and KCS are constantly investing in tech that makes them even more efficient, even more sustainable. Anyway, stay tuned because we'll have more on this in pods to come. All right, it's the panel. Jenni, Byrne, Scott, Reid. with me to recap the week in politics. How are you?
Good. How are you?
How are you, Jenni?
Great.
I'm great. I'm great. I'm not quite where Reid is on the full Habs paraphernalia yet. It looks like they kind of sewed up a playoff spot last night, but I'm not filled with as much enthusiasm about that as I ought to be. So
there's so little joy in my life. I figured I had to go all in. I mean, a 2-1 victory over the Calgary Flames that involved, as far as I could tell, no skating or shots on goal by either team. It was the most uninteresting thing I've ever done with 3 hours. But at least we got the W and the 2 points, and so I've got to okay, this is all I had to look forward to in my life. I'm really hitting a blah wall, man. I'm just. Aren't you?
Speaking of 3 boring hours.
Yeah.
Did either of you watch the Academy Awards?
No.
Any part of it?
Yes, I watched a little bit of it. It was not interesting.
They stripped every entertainment value out of it. Every bit of entertainment value was stripped out of it, and it was so earnest. Everything about it was so earnest. It was a complete comedy and irony-free zone. It was unwatchable. These people taking themselves so seriously.
I didn't even know it was on until I saw someone tweet about it halfway through the night. But they put the ratings out yesterday. It's been the lowest watched Academy Awards ever.
How could it not be? I have seen none of the movies. None of the movies. I didn't even know those movies were released or available anywhere. I started searching for some of them. I never heard of most of them. It's terrible. And I love movies. I'm like, oh my God. John Wick hasn't been nominated for anything. This is ridiculous. What are these people down there thinking? And how can Chadwick Boseman not get the award? I don't know either one of those movies, but how can he not get the Academy Award and Anthony Hopkins get it? Anthony Hopkins needs another Oscar? Come on. Boseman doesn't have another shot at it, man. This is ridiculous. Anyway.
They set the whole show up for him to win. They switched it around so that Best Actor was last, assuming that Boseman was going to win.
My favorite Anthony Hopkins role is Magic. Remember that movie from the 1970s where he has the doll and the doll goes, the doll
with Richard Benjamin.
Is it Richard Benjamin or Robbie? Yes, yeah, it is Richard Benjamin. Sorry, and Anne Margaret is the love interest, and he's got a place on the lake. Stick with me, Jenni. You're going to really like this. And the doll goes crazy. The ventriloquist doll starts going crazy. And but I love ventriloquist doll stories. Love them. Can't get enough of them. There's 2. Did
the doll try to kill him or something?
It started murdering people. It leads you to believe that maybe the doll didn't do it, that Anthony Hopkins did. But sort of. But Chucky isn't a ventriloquist doll. He's just a doll. Very different genre altogether.
This is how Hollywood works. All right, maybe politics. Should we talk politics? I don't know. Anybody interested in politics? Yeah.
I don't
know. Since we last met, we spent some time last week talking about how bad the weekend before last weekend was for the Ford government and how we'd never seen a meltdown like that. Well, after we recorded our show, the Premier did a news conference and he was apologetic about what it wasn't clear. What he felt he'd done wrong was not obvious, but he was very apologetic to the point of tears. And he promised a sick day program. In fact, the best sick day program in North America, he promised. And now we are almost a week after that. We have nothing. And we hear that they're asking the feds to administer their program for them. So these people aren't very good at this, are they?
Well, Scott, you want to answer because you, of course, you're the one that defends the government. So,
yeah, leave it to me. First of all, let me just say, no, I that apology fucking lit me up like a firecracker. That pissed me off so much, man. Geez, folks, and I'm working around the clock here. I'm working 24/7. This bullshit thing about you have no idea how hard it is. Actually, lots of people know how fucking hard it is. Lots and lots of people know how hard it is. And yeah, I know what it's like in government during a crisis. And I know that people are working 24/7. But ultimately, you're judged not on the basis of how much time you spend working at it, but whether or not you do it and whether you do it well. And he's done it badly. And where we're at is, at least in part, a direct consequence of explicit choices they made, like we discussed ad infinitum last week. So I won't pile back on about this. But I would just make the obvious point, which you've hinted at, David, which is that if you felt so fucking awful about it, then you would fucking do something fucking about it and not spend 1 week preparing a letter to the federal government saying, we are prepared to move on the best plan ever for paid leave if you'll do all the administration, and we are concerned about all the gaps. Like, I just go back to it. Politically, I just do not understand this. The attention and focus on this is manifest. You're being evaluated on it on a daily and hourly basis. Move with some urgency for the good of the public health imperatives and for the good of the political imperatives. And I don't understand why the best political move, if you want to get into Fed-Prov finger pointing, isn't to bring in the actual best policy and then say, hey, feds, here are the 5 things we've done because the federal recovery program isn't good enough. The federal recovery benefit and sick leave benefit isn't good enough. And we want to put pressure on you to fill in some of those gaps. I like writing a letter that implies this is going to be contingent upon a bunch of things from the feds. Like, it just smacks.
Doesn't every day matter? Like it's now. Like it's the next 2 months. It's the next 2 months. It's not like you can roll this out eventually. And by the way, I want to correct you on something important. The premier said he's working 18 hours a day, 24/7.
18. Okay. Well,
18 hours a day, 24/7.
Right. Okay. Well, that's 6 hours to check in on deco labels and have a cigarette. I'll just say one thing more. And then to compound the politics, like if Jenni, I know this. If you were working in his office and they knew that Coteau bill on sick leave was coming up, you would have, sure as shit, a plan in place before the legislature was asked to vote on it, not after, so that you wouldn't put yourself through the front page spectacle of voting against paid sick leave when you've committed to bring in the best program ever. It's like sinking someone's lifeboat and then saying, don't worry, guys, we'll be back in a week with the best ship ever. And it's like, no, I'm fucking drowning now. Just makes me mad.
Well, I'd like to think there's a lot of things that would be happening different around the pandemic response if I and some of my other former colleagues were around. But we could talk for hours just on that. I think that the last week for the government, I don't think was any better for the Ontario government was any better than what the week before was. Even though we did talk about last week, it can't go down from there. And I actually think that it has. And so I'm not sure whether the letter from Peter Benthalvey went before Doug's press conference to the feds. I think it was the same, or when it went after. Either way, Scott, I agree with you. So one of the biggest problems that the Ontario government has said that they've identified with the program publicly is that there's too big of a gap between when workers file a claim and they get their money back, as well as the conditions are too stringent. So Ontario seems to be in this weird position where they're saying the plan is inadequate, but they're not actually really going after the federal government. To Scott's point, they're trying to say, well, let's just do an enhanced plan and we'll fill in the gaps. But if filling in the gaps is to address the timeliness of when workers that have to take time off get the checks, I don't see how this does it. Like if that's the biggest problem that the government has addressed. And so I think that I think that the Ford government felt they had a really good end of the week because, we're back on Doug's strengths. It's kind of like what we talked about last week. Doug is just desperate, and the government's desperate to get back to April of 2020. Go in a time machine, and people want empathy, and they don't. They want to know governments are in control, which is why Trudeau has actually changed his style. He's less in the touchy-feely approach, and he's more in the clinical, this is what I'm doing approach. It's probably because Canadians' headspace is in a different heads are in a different place, and also he's getting ready to head into an election, which we can talk about afterwards. But I think that coming on the heels of Doug having an emotional breakdown, seemingly on TV in a press conference, they then turn around and say, we've got everything under control, except we've got 27 nurses coming from New Brunswick. We got 9 nurses, including the Premier's healthcare officials, including the Premier of Newfoundland's wife. And by the way, we even though we said we didn't, we've asked the Army to come in, and now they're dispatching medical units from around the country to come and help. So I think that Ontarians, regardless of the government thinking that they're showing empathy and they're doing things, I think it's just becoming more and more chaotic. And I think that Ontarians that I speak to, my friends and family, they're like, Jesus, are we ever getting out of this?
I think the Army thing is hilarious because they did turn it down, a week ago, 2 weeks ago? It's like, you can't offer us that help. We demand it.
No, I think, David, it was almost worse. I think they actually contacted the government. I think that the officials from Ontario contacted the feds. The feds said, we've gotten a request and we'll do it. The province came out and said, no, we haven't, even though they had. And then now they've circled on back and said, yeah, about that request we put in 2 weeks ago, we kind of need it now.
So, I mean, normally when you talk about governments, you argue about what their goals and objectives are. You don't like a government because it does too much of this or too little of that, all that kind of stuff. In this case, though, we're just talking about the basic competence of these people. We're just talking about the basic ability to be in government. They don't have it. Like, it's an untalented group of people. I'm saying this right now.
I generally take this position when we talk about things like this. I usually say to people, if something doesn't make sense about what government is doing, if it's really confounding you, then chances are there's a dimension to it that you're not thinking. Like there's a political motivation that may not matter to you, but does matter to them. There are a set of considerations that are complex that they've not articulated and that you might not appreciate, because ultimately these people are generally well-intended regardless of party stripe, and they're generally very competent. And I don't know if the answer to your question is yes, it's all a barrel of monkeys, but I do think it starts at the top. And I think that Ford has demonstrated that he does not command people's confidence when it comes to the literal management of this crisis now, right? Can he get the tone right? Can he cry at a microphone and convince people, geez, I really care? Okay, that's fine. But we're past the point, as Jenni says, of caring whether or not you care. We are at the point where we care about whether it gets better and whether you're doing the things 1, 2, 3 steps in a row that make it better. And, this Army thing is a perfect, it's just like running around in the kitchen, pissing on a hot stove and then saying, God, it smells in here. What's happened? Well, you happened. It's just, so it is incompetence.
Well, and I think also it's the ridiculousness of some of the policies. And so not to rehash what we talked about last week, but because the cases in Ontario are still going up, instead of addressing some fundamental issues and fundamental reasons, and talking about where the case spread is, instead they cordon off, the cherry blossoms at High Park, and John Tory is complicit in that. He relishes that he feeds into Doug's worst instincts in terms of shutting shit down, and putting plastic bags over basketball hoops in the city, or ripping down the actual rims so people can't play, and people aren't abiding by this because there's no hope that there's any getting out of it, because the more and more lockdown measures that happen, the more the cases continue, because there's actually no addressing where the case spread is. And I know that we'll probably get into the situation in Peel, the meat processing plants, Amazon. There have been no plans by any level of government, provincial or federally. If I was Doug, I know that the provincial government has now going after the feds on the border. Their messaging would have been extremely good in March and April of 2020. Their messaging is about a year late, but there are legitimate questions that and ask that the Ontario government and all provinces could ask on the feds. Okay, so 70% or so of, if not more, of people that cross the border are deemed essential, so they don't have to quarantine. They don't have a regime for rapid tests. Those are truck drivers, healthcare workers, and I'm not saying they should quarantine. I'm not saying essential workers should be should have any more hassle in crossing the border. But how in a year and almost a year and a half, and almost 15 months, has there not been a rapid testing program for people that craft across the border two or three times a week? And for non-essential travel, there's a whole litany of exemptions. Amateur athletes, movie productions, what have you. If the government truly wanted to like have a conversation as to if we're closing the border, so to speak, they would be calling on that and just saying a blanket closure of the border. Because right now, non-essential travel, if you don't have an exemption, if you're not a Canadian citizen and you just want to come and visit your friend and you live in the UK and you have no exemption or you have no valid reason for coming that falls into those lists, you can't come.
Jenni, one last question about the province, though. Why would they have cabinet meetings without officials? Governments do have cabinet meetings without officials when they want to discuss purely political matters. But when you're discussing how you're going to manage the pandemic, why would you kick the officials out of the room?
And staff, they said. Is that true?
Yeah,
do you know?
Yeah, it was one of the orders from that Thursday. The big list of rules. I don't know. To your point, David, I've said many times in cabinet meetings. I'll be honest. The difference between how the federal cabinet ran and the provincial cabinet, it was a very shocking, stark difference from when I went to Queen's Park from how things were run federally. And Scott, I assume that what we saw as staffers was pretty much the same. I think the vast majority of the structures between probably Martin and Harper were almost very similar in terms of, and to your point, David, there are times, especially when you're having cabinet committee meetings, your P&P, your priorities and planning, and your operations, which is more of the political side of discussing like communications, rollout of government policies or issues management. There were times at the end it would be like, okay, well, we're done the agenda. Could we ask that this be exempt, because this be ministers only? So I'm not sure how a cabinet can function without having officials or political staff in the meetings at all. And I think that what they were concerned about was leaks, but stuff is still leaking out, and what they're doing is they're on their back feet now because they're having no political advice or support. I'm wondering, are the cabinet ministers like sitting around on the weekend or sitting around writing it themselves? Like, all right, well, okay, Bob, can you get on the Google and check this out? And we're going to write the legislation, whereas blah, blah, blah. So I don't know how it's functioning. And obviously it's not functioning to our early part of the conversation. It's not functioning well.
Can I just add something on that? Because I find that, and this may be a deep dive for people, but I find that particular aspect of it really puzzling. Like, now is a time, people always demur at this term, but now is a time for centralized government. Now is a time for centralized decision making. It really genuinely is, because you've got to make hard trade-off choices. You've got to make decisions about resource allocation. None of them, it's not a choice between easy and hard. It's a choice between shitty and fatal, and you must make calls, and it's got to be informed by all those questions of degree that you need the public service to inform you of, then you need to have political staff to help put a screen on it, and then you need to come to a conclusion on that as a matter of cabinet. And the idea that they would, you would often have cabinet meetings where you would say, okay, well, we've had a good discussion about this. A presentation has been made by officials, have walked in a presentation. It's been anchored by one of the ministers. They've gone through the situation and then provided with recommendations. And then you would say, okay, you know what? There's political aspects of this, so we're going to ask officials to leave the room, and then you would have a discussion with staff, by the way. That happens all the time, and that is entirely sensible. To say we're going to kick staff and officials out of the room, we're going to be unshaped and uninformed by all of these considerations that have, stemmed from the science and health table, and we're just going to talk about what are our collective stakeholders sort of think, and what are the trade-offs, and you end up at the end of that with closed down playgrounds and golf courses. It's just like it goes to your competency issue, David. Anybody who knows how cabinet government works says, well, wait a minute, where's the leadership at the front of the room? Why isn't the premier saying, guys, we may not like this. These are the decisions we have to make. These are the 4 things. And if somebody gets in your face as a cabinet minister at one of those points, at some point in a discussion like that, the premier or the prime minister eventually says, I'm gaveling this thing to a close. We've had enough cock and discussion. It's not a democracy. We're doing this. It doesn't sound like any of that occurred there. Like Stephen Harper would not tolerate 9 hours in a cabinet room with just his ministers, with everybody, fucking spouting off about every single thing that they think or consider. Like he just wouldn't.
Well, and this is the difference in structures. I'm not sure how you guys were, but for us, cabinet met, the full of cabinet met fairly infrequently. A lot of it was for approving appointments and on budget days and what have you. The Priorities and Planning Committee, chaired by the Prime Minister, was the committee that oversaw all the policy of the government. And there was other ones. There was that flowed up. So you had Priorities and Planning. You had the Operations Committee, which looked more of, to Scott, your point, the political aspect, or if there was a crisis that came up that would be like dealing the reactionary crisis. And then you had energy and the environment. You had social policy. You had justice, and so you had the different committees that all the policy flew up. So cabinet was involved in the implementation. And so I can understand with COVID, at least at the start, being a bit more nimble. But I think the government, did, or at least thought they did at the start, where they said, we're going to have a COVID committee, and which probably was good. You could have a pandemic committee, but what that ended up being was like 800 health officials. So you didn't have a true cabinet committee that was actually running the show or having fulsome policy discussions. That's all gone to all of cabinet. So that's like the cast of Ben-Hur then is like all these decisions go from cabinet, but they seemingly have already been made, but by health bureaucrats. And so it's been missing so many parts in between. And I think that you might have been able to kind of muddle about for the first month or two, but I'm not sure why there hasn't been more of a structure, Scott. To your point, I know how we structured things even during crisis, and it's nothing like this. So you basically got the 800 person, and I'm exaggerating, but it's up in the hundreds of the healthcare table that are making these decisions. And then it literally is full cabinet. There's nothing in between. And the different structure is, and I'm not sure if this was under, if this is a provincial government thing, but like Doug doesn't chair cabinet meetings. He doesn't chair. There's a separate chair. Vic Fideli is the chair of cabinet, which always stunned me. But I'm told that that was the practice under the Liberals as well. Actually am not sure.
I was really surprised when I read to Queen's Park, and that was true for Kathleen as well. Like I was, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say. Like, I mean, the job of the center is to manage this stuff between cabinet office and the premier's office. It's to get to a place where those cabinet committees make decisions.
Isn't the truth of the matter that most provincial governments are run not by their cabinets, they're run by a handful of people? Like if real power in Ottawa is pretty concentrated, it's even more concentrated in provincial capitals. And it's because of the talent pool, frankly, that you're working with. So most provincial governments are run by a few ministers who are highly competent, and the premier's office and the bureaucracy. So who are those central people? Who are those 5 or 6 people in this operation that are really running it?
It sounds like a handful of them were asked to leave the room.
Well, first of all, Jamie Wallace right. would normally be one of those people. Is he one of those people?
Right now, I don't know if there's an exemption to cabinet for the Secretary of Cabinet, which is Stephen Davidson now, and the Chief of Staff. I would assume there would be, but I don't know. I don't know if there's an exemptions for them to be to represent the political wing and represent the government. Represent the government when it is a very different structure. There were a couple of observations I would make. The difference, the osmosis between the two offices is very, and I think we've talked about this privately. I'm not sure if we've talked about it on the pod. Was very strange to me when the clerks would brief the Prime Minister. If we were in Longevant, for example, he would come down. The clerk, whichever it was, would come down to the Prime Minister's office, go right to his office, and then go right back up. If there was a meeting elsewhere, because the first 2 floors are political, the clerk never wandered around, just popping in and saying hi. He would come to a meeting, but he's not wandering around to see who's in their office.
Not even Himmelfarb?
Himmelfarb.
Not even Himmelfarb?
Wandering around for sure.
He was gone. He was gone soon enough. We honored. I think you guys asking us to appoint him to Italy as the ambassador.
Yeah,
it wasn't me. Can I just please take myself off the table? No, I did not make any request for Alex.
Neither did I.
Hey, let's move on to the feds. Let's move on to the feds because one issue, it's not nearly as big or important as COVID, but it's been interesting me, is this General Vance, Chief of Defense Staff issue. So this guy, apparently, by the evidence that is emerging, has some personal picadillos in his life that are not really appropriate for his position. The way that the feds have handled this issue seems to have taken those personal picadillos, which have nothing to do with Prime Minister Trudeau whatsoever, and step by step moved them right into the next office to his office. And this is now his problem to wear rather than Vance's. How did they let that happen? How did that go down? What is going on there?
Well, I just don't think D&D is a priority for this government. So I think whatever was happening was not something that they generally really cared about. I think on the list of issues, probably when this was coming up, it was probably not top of mind to them. Plus, the military is somewhat like political parties. They have their own cliques and factions, and what have you. It's not just based on the different, like, Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. They all have, this general hates this general, and like all the people underneath him. Like it is like a political party, and so I'm assuming there was probably his people were doing a fair bit of protecting him to the minister's office as well as to the PMO. And there's also, it's just the story. It's hard to, I think that hearing the story without a formal complaint, it would be, it would seem as if you're hearing this. So he was in a 20-year relationship with someone. We've now found out that he's fathered 2 of her 8 children. He was married, she was married seemingly for the entire time. He was married for part of the time. And then the relationship seemed to collapse once he was appointed, CDS. And so I think it's just, it seems on the outside of a 20-year consensual relationship. I'm not defending the fact that he was in an obvious position of power over her during the entire time that they were together. And whether it was consensual or not, that's a court-martialing offense. Like, that's in the eyes of the military, whether he could have asked her to marry him and it wouldn't have mattered, because he still actually broke military law.
Scott, isn't it Sajan's job to keep this from the Prime Minister's office?
Yeah, in abstract, yes, absolutely. I would think so. But I'm not certain. This does get down to like the culture of different governments and sort of, issue management is one of those places where it does vary government to government, like how much of it is kept at satellite and how much of it is immediately brought in so that it can be managed. And there's a tension there, right? Like, do you want to run to the PMO so that they're informed so that as things unravel, you go, oh God, they're right in the heat of this? Or do you deliberately try to keep that a little bit removed? I just don't know I literally have no idea what happened here. And it's very hard to follow because Jenni did a fantastic job of summarizing it. And it's a sorted, freaking plot from like The Edge of Night. Like, it's bizarro, right? Like, it's
and The Edge of Night had a killing puppet too.
Did it? Oh my gosh. Wow.
I used to watch it. My great aunts babysat me, and they used to love The Edge of Night. But it had a puppet that killed people. It's been off air for a while. I think it got body slammed by The Young and the Restless back around 1981.
But it's a 20-year affair, I guess. I don't know what, it's 20-year relationship of some kind. Obviously, it's in contradiction to rules. I think your point about the intramural nature of the military as an institution is a really important one. My guess is that has a lot to do with this. The cliques and which cliques are wielding influence at the political level at any given time. And it feels to me like this guy was somewhat shielded by that. And it's all blown up in his face. And as it blows up in his face, it blows up in the government's face. I don't know how you could have acted. If I understand the exact initial complaint and not really complaint, the initial first reports of it, I'm not sure. It would have been tricky to handle as an issues management because you don't have a formal complaint. What do? It appears as though there's a contradiction of protocol and rules and regulations. You, by the way, as a government, have championed a higher standard with respect to sexual misconduct in the armed forces. This does not conform to that in a very obvious way. It's a mess, but it falls into the category of one of those messes that if you're the opposition, you say, we need to pursue this, and we need to see what benefit, to be very blunt, what benefit can be made of this politically in terms of trying to harm the government. But I don't think it tracks with people. I don't know if it would track with people in a normal time because it feels so precise and patent place, but it really doesn't track, I don't think, in a time of COVID. It just can't compete. And so almost focusing on it sends a signal of misplaced priority on the part of the opposition. So it's tricky for the opposition party is what I'm saying. Like, you can't literally abandon the issue, but if you appear to place too great a priority on it, people go, well, you care about this more than you care about borders and vaccine rollout? Like, isn't that where you should be placing the emphasis? So, you got to figure out a rhythm to, pursue this thing methodically, extract whatever pound of flesh you can from the government, but not appear as though you're placing a disproportionate focus on it.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I think I 100% agree with that. I think if I'm the government, I would much rather the opposition ask me about this than I would about, the vaccine procurement, because because that's where you're actually vulnerable. That's where you're actually vulnerable on. So, and to your point, Scott, it's just with so many other issues going on right now, people are just so captivated with COVID and all things related to COVID that this is not resonating. The only people that I generally talk to about it or have messaged or called me about it are friends that I have serving or retired out of the forces. It's kind of an internal. It would be like us following internal party politics issues, not to diminish it.
So speaking of things that people don't have any attention span for during COVID. Somebody said on Twitter last week that they have a drinking game that every time Jenni, somebody says on the panel, Jenni was right, they have a drink. So get your glass ready because the federal budget just delivered last week is over. And it's not in the news coverage anymore. In fact, Mercedes Stephenson had Chrystia Freeland on the West Block for half an hour this weekend and didn't even ask her a question about the budget, asked her only about the Vance business. I know that that's an agenda, but basically the budget has disappeared from the news. The polling indicates that not many people absorbed much from it. Those that did lean positive toward it. Some NDP voters found it very compelling, but by and large, the thing came and went without much of a political trace. How is that possible? It's an enormous budget.
Well, it's a win. It's a win for it's a true win for the government. It's so they couldn't have asked for a better outcome. There's no one angry at the best. Depending on the poll, you're up a couple points. At the worst, you've stayed kind of static or maybe down one. I know Ipsos had a poll out yesterday with I think an 8-point lead for the Liberals.
11.
Abacus had one out for 7 or 8 today.
7. So it's probably somewhere between 7 and 11.
Yeah. So I think Canadians are. I just don't think it. I just don't think it resonated. I think people heard there was a budget. I think they probably heard a couple policy initiatives, and they probably remembered them for a day. I bet if you asked the average person, what was the cornerstone of the budget that Chrystia Freeland delivered last week, 2 weeks ago, they wouldn't have they wouldn't remember. They wouldn't say, oh, what was it? Oh yeah, childcare, that childcare program. So I just think it's done. It was like a tree falling in the forest. If you're not there, did you hear it? And that's ultimately what it is. And the opposition got no traction on it, and ergo the polls have stayed the same.
Well, if it was a tree falling in the forest, it was a Douglas fucking fir, because it was a big tree, right? And I think, it's such a strange time, right? Like a couple of weeks ago, the government gave $6.9 billion to Air Canada in a rescue package. Can you imagine a time when people would see $6.9 billion given? And I think it's a justifiable decision. Don't get me wrong. I don't know if it should be $6 billion or $5 billion, or I don't know what the right number is, but it's not that I'm contesting the choice. I'm just saying, like, imagine that isn't like an earthquake set of news, and that's what we live in this kind of circumstance. So, like, if you're thinking about committing murder, now's the time, right? It's hard to bust through from a news perspective.
But Scott, Jenni looked at it from the perspective of the government got no blowback, the opposition has no traction, therefore the budget's a win.
That's where I'm going.
You and I've talked about preconditioning and all these kinds of things. They had a centerpiece of that budget, childcare, which they devoted, a very, very large amount of money to, and they intended it to be the centerpiece of the budget. I did see one poll, I don't remember the source in its early days, that a tiny fraction of people with children in childcare thought they were going to benefit from this budget, even though Freeland promised them that their rates would drop by half next year.
So that's where I was going. Like, to my mind, Jenni's analysis that the budget didn't matter and that's a win, I think that's 75% true, but it leaves the government with 25% work. And the 25% work, I think, really does center around childcare, because they've made this huge investment. And, we talked about this before. I think there's juice in the $10 a day commitment, but people don't know about it, and people can't want it and can't vote for it, no matter how big that cohort is. And you, David, say that cohort's bound to be smaller than I would think, but in any event, you're not going to get the benefit of that unless those people know about it. So I think the government has a marketing job. I don't think it should be content with this and say, you know what, went by relatively unscathed, it didn't cost us anything. I'm 75% great with that if I'm in government. But 25% of me says, I got to market like a son of a bitch. I've got to find ways to get to the constituencies that I think will care. I'm going to look at those constituencies, from the perspective of who does it matter most to, and where do I need to win most, and I'm going to do the overlay of those things and find out where the congruent parts are, and pound away with, I don't know if it's paid social media, I don't know if it's other kinds of ways. It ain't going to be through earned media in this current blizzard of COVID news, but I'm going to find ways to keep pounding on that, because I think, one, there's appetite, particularly in suburban Toronto and suburban Vancouver, for that, and you need that to solidify. And two, looking at it through another lens, you want to make certain that you keep the NDP in a sort of 17-18% box. You don't want them creeping up to 25-26. And saying that you've delivered on something of that kind might be a good way of saying, of convincing those NDP Liberal switchers, I don't need to switch. I'm getting what I'm shopping for out of this government here in Ottawa.
Well, who the government really has to initially convince on this program are actually the premiers, because the program is a Fed Prov program, and I'm not going to go into my thoughts in terms of, I actually think the Liberals would be very happy in 3 years if they're sitting a year away from 3 years into the majority government and have an extra $30 billion that had been earmarked that they can spend. But my guess is this, we'll see how big of a priority it is, because I still maintain we're going into an election sooner rather than later. I think probably the COVID situation in the biggest provinces has kind of changed the mindset. Where we are now is much different than where we were a month and a half ago. But where the big, we'll see if this is part of the signature plank that the government runs on. Will this be one of their first out of the gate where they talk about every day, where it's part of Trudeau's stump, where it's on all of their literature, where every candidate is talking about it, $10 a day daycare. So it'll be interesting to see if that is a true priority. If it's lower down, if the Liberals aren't campaigning on it, I think it shows that it was a budget tactic, but not necessarily a big P political one for them.
Yeah.
Maybe they won't need policies at all. Maybe they won't need policies at all, Jenny. This was Vaccinate the Leaders Week in Canada. You had some thoughts about how that all went down from a photo op point of view.
Yeah, I think Singh was the first one out of the gate. I think Trudeau looked like him and Sophie look, the pretty couple they are. He pulled out his arm with the tattoo. So he's like, people are like, oh, look, he's cool. He's a 50-year-old guy with a tattoo. Sophie wore a pretty sweater. She put her neck down, didn't pull out her arm, obviously wasn't wearing a bra. For any woman in their late 40s, that's extremely impressive.
Don't think David missed that detail. He was on that too. It wasn't just women that noticed.
I threw a like to Aaron and Rebecca getting their vaccinations. They did a drive-through in Ottawa on Saturday. I think it wasn't the magnitude of the Trudeau photo op, but Trudeau's a celebrity. We've talked about it. It got covered around the world. I think the minor thing, if I had been Aaron's team, I would have maybe had one of the kids in the back of the car film them actually getting it, making, you're not gonna compete on the, like the official photographer type image and video. So make it a bit more like, have your kids in the back, look at mom and dad just got their vaccines kind of thing. But, I think it sends a good message that all the leaders are pushing out. I think more and more people pushing out that they're getting vaccinated. I hopefully will, if anyone has any hesitancy, the more and more people they see get vaccinated, the more likely they are to go in as well.
Scott, this is not something that the PMO, the Trudeau PMO would do lightly or whimsically. They would have thought through every second of the photo op and what each of them does and when they do it, and all practiced it and rehearsed it, and it would have been perfect, right?
Absolutely. This is the Wayne Gretzky of PMOs when it comes to photo ops. They know what they're doing, and they know how to position their athlete to succeed. It was... I didn't understand the O'Toole photo op. I'm not trying to pile on, but I didn't like the car thing. Like, the car thing is like, you can't see through the window. It's like, what, I didn't really... I know he doesn't have some of the tools that Trudeau has to work with, and the PMO is always going to win a photo op contest with other leaders, but I didn't think that he got as much out of it as he could have. But, first of all, on the more substantive, serious point, there are pockets of hesitancy in the country. There are now real anxieties about AstraZeneca, and so you see different points of view about that. There's some hesitancy there's different regional polling shows that there's some regional pockets of hesitancy. And you got, that fucking moron, Randy Hillier, and, his... idiot sidekick Derek Sloan running around, proclaiming the joys of freedom and cemeteries. So I'm glad to see people doing this. It needs to happen. I'm glad to see leaders doing this and setting that example. And so I'm all for it. The Trudeau photo op was it to boost vaccinations or matrimony, though? Like, it was like, wow, those people are married and they're in love. And, there's a lot of divorced middle-aged people. A lot of middle-aged people aren't happy in their marriages. I think those folks might have been feeling left a little out in the cold by that photo op, because I'm like, wow, man, Jesus Christ, those people look happy. I think I better go to the fridge and get another bottle of beer. But
judging by the reactions I saw from women to Trudeau's vaccination, they weren't thinking about his marriage.
The well-muscled shoulder, with the Thunderbird on it. You're like, oh. Now, they know how to, man, they can knock those bowling pins down. They know what they're fucking doing when it comes to that stuff. They know what they're working with.
Well, and they got I think it was the Daily Mail did a photo spread, and it started with the vaccination, but then it went to all the other times that like Trudeau has showed off his arm. So it, showed him training for when he boxed Brazeau, and then it showed him boxing Brazeau, and then there was another shirtless or sleeveless photo. So that's the kind of imagery that was going out around the world.
If I look like that, I wouldn't put my shirt on for G7 summits. I'm just saying, I think the guy shows restraint.
He looks tougher to me than when he beat Brazeau. I think he's filled out. He's stronger. Yeah.
He's carrying around those opposition leaders.
It's Hey You time.
All right.
It's Hey You time. I'm going to go first because I've got a relatively light one. I'm going to throw out my Hey You to Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland. Nobody else wants to talk about your budget. I want to talk about your budget. I'm still interested in your budget. I've talked to Don Drummond, Jim Stanford, Peter Nicholson, Kate Besenson, Mark Carney, and I have questions. And I bet you have answers. So come on the Herle Burly and let's spend an hour talking about your budget.
There we go.
My hey yous to the Liberal government, and in particular Stephen Guilbeault. Friday, the Heritage Committee passed. They were going clause by clause on Bill C-10, and passed a motion that the CRTC would have the oversight of any uploaded video content. There had been an exemption for social media companies, the YouTubes, the Facebooks. That there would be an exempt. So this is so basically what this means is the CRTC would oversee not what social media companies upload, although because they would be the middle managers. It would be what you upload, what Canadians put on their Facebook pages, what they put on YouTube. So this would give oversight to the CRTC, which is such an overreach of government, and I think that this is something that the government needs to look at, because obviously they have a very, very activist minister that has his own extreme views on this topic.
My hey you is to Doug Ford. We've talked about this incessantly for the past 2 weeks, but I really, really, really strenuously mean it when I say, Doug Ford, just finish this goddamn job on paid leave. Don't turn it into some kind of faux fight between yourself and Ottawa. You promised, through tears, in the face of crisis, you promised the best paid leave plan. People need it. I have a personal friend whose husband worked at a job where he could not leave. He got sick. 2 of his kids got sick. He endured all of that because he could not afford to not go to work. Bring in the best sick leave plan ever. Fulfill your promise. Keep your word. Don't fuck people on the margins of this thing and play a game. Get it done.
Mike Spitali was saying to me before the show that somebody should ask Ford which jurisdiction has the best sick leave plan in North America and what attributes make it the best sick leave plan in North America.
Yeah, well, that's just pulling the wings off the fly. Forget it.
All right, Scott, I just want to say that if the Canadians go on a deep run in the playoffs, I have no idea what your beard is going to be like at the end of that, because I presume you're going to be adhering to the no shaving during the playoffs rule.
I'm not sure. You know what? I'm getting pretty close to the point where I think I may have to take the razor to my whole entire head. It's not just the beard, The hair is getting in the way of my life. It's getting it's starting to bother me, so we'll see.
It's got a Joe Thornton look going.
Yeah, no, there's an entire family of Keebler elves living in the beard now, and
Jenni, you don't think he should cut his hair? You don't think he should shave his head? If you're going to be completely bald, you've got to have a nice head, and I'm betting against Reid on that.
No, I'm not shaving the head. I'm going to shave the hair down. I don't like long hair, but here I am. Anyway, enough about me. David, you've got long weird hair too, so let's focus on some of the changes you should be making.
The only change that I need to make is I've put on a shocking amount of weight through this pandemic. I'm fat, fucking fat. And it's really, I can't even hide it now. It's apparent in this shot as well. So that is, you may be growing hair, but I am adding pounds. It's horrible.
Beard covers all those chins.
Jenni, you look great.
Do you guys think there's any chance the Habs are going to like if they end up in a first round matchup with the Leafs, do you think there's any chance we can win that? Do you think there's some kind of like
Let's channel 2010. No one thought they could beat Washington. No one thought they could beat Pittsburgh. We would have rather had taken the Rangers in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, and we shit the bed with them. But no one would have thought we would have been able to get past the 1 and 2 teams in the Eastern Conference back in 2010. So we've got to channel that energy.
Carey shows up for the spotlight.
But it's a Cinderella run.
Yeah.
It's a Cinderella run, and the slipper, the midnight shows up at some point on those things. They're just not. I started the year thinking that they were a good team that was genuinely competitive, and that is not true. So I don't really give a shit whether they get past 1 round in the playoffs or not.
Well,
I'll take any success I can get.
Yeah, screw you, Dave.
Yeah.
Screw me. All right, well, that is the last line of the pod this week. Screw me. Thank you both. Love you both. Great to see you, and we'll be back next week with more of this.
Ciao.
Well, I should thank people. I should thank our listeners. I should thank our viewers. I should thank our listeners and viewers. I should thank the Air Quotes Media team. I got to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. And everybody, we will be back next week. See you then.